back again after repeating my Portland trip that I took last year in September. There were some slight differences. I did stay in the hotel and I did spend a lot of time and money at Powell's Books, but I also opened it out just a little bit, which I'm going to cover. I'm not going to go through every book I bought. I bought over 50 books, but I am going to go through the highlight.
Besides Powell's City of Books, this trip I also visited Cameron's Books and Magazines, which is Portland's oldest bookstore, apparently, and contains this corridor of vintage paperbacks, which can be visited by request, but you can't just walk in. It's actually behind an employees-only area. But I wound up finding quite a pile of books up there. This was a good visit in the sense that I got the driving pretty well figured out again, and I didn't manage to get myself lost at all. That's the big thing for me in Portland, usually. I went with some cheap hotel that I'd gone in back in September. This was the Howard Johnson by Wyndham, which they'd have you believe is a modern shiny place like this, but in reality is more crap. It's the doors of the building open outward onto rickety stairs with small landings that are keyed, so if you're hauling luggage up, you're going to have a bad time. I did. The keys are unreliable when you can figure out which way to stick them in. The room had been repainted pretty shabbily, actually. There was spatter on light fixtures and walls and on the back of the toilet. And getting checked in itself was kind of a feat, since the computers kept taking turns crapping out. So the books, the tiniest one I found was another illustrated ghost story for Christmas from the Haunted Bookshelf. It's a short story in book form illustrated by this guy named Seth. Wakefield was a writer for Weird Tales that I'd been trying to track down for some time. It'd actually been years he'd been on my list. The dude's supposed to be like another M.R. James. The oldest book I picked up was the 1867 Edward Bulwer Lytton hardback Eugene Arrow, which is in really solid shape considering. Lytton was one that I've actually read, and I'm pretty into him, although he's kind of a joke to some people. Don't ask me why. He's most famous for Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, an influential early science fantasy thing. I ordered Vril on Amazon years ago, and it came in this terrible print-on-demand edition with a cover that was so poorly done that I actually designed and printed off my own cover to slap on it, which is inspired by 60s and 70s Bantam paperbacks, kind of unrelated to the subject, but so were the paperbacks. My idea was that the cover could be more informational and less of a wasted space, so it's got a lot of stuff about Lytton on it and such, but that's on my DA. You can go look at it there. When I got into town, I rushed right over to Powell's from the parking garage. The first place I went was the Rare Book Room. I really wanted to find something old and pulpy there, like this! However, this 1920s Old and Young King Brady did not come from Powell's. That's something I ordered, but I'm showing it as an example. They did, however, have this Armed Services edition of Canal Town, which I grabbed from my friend Charlie, who collects those. You can see the Armed Services editions have the distinction of having the spine on the short side rather than the long side. I think they're all abridged in some form or other, in spite of the fact that they actually are not that small. Charlie, you'll get to see this in person soon enough. 70s Fanzine! This is Famous Fantastic Classics #1 from 1974. It reprints pulp goodness from hard-to-find guys like Homer Eon Flint and Arthur Leo Zagat. I did some research, and the uncredited editor on this is a Robert E. Weinberg. I actually had to create the Goodreads entry for this one myself. The original magazine illustrations are in there, and they're freaking awesome! I mentioned before about British Penny Dreadful author George W. M. Reynolds, and I was scouring the place for any Penny Dreadfuls I could turn up. And then with the help of a friendly staff member, I turned up this one, Wagner the Werewolf. It's a large-sized Dover edition. That it was in the oversized science fiction section in the corner of the Gold Room. It's frickin' swank. It has illustrations and an introduction by Bleeler, maybe it's Blyler. I really hoped they'd have something like Edward Viles, like Black Bess and Night of the Road. I've got volume 1 of that. I'm looking for other volumes. But they told me not only had that book never been in the store, neither had the author. Well, shit. Who needs no introduction? The incomparable Dennis Wheatley. I guess he's kind of a big deal. This is Contraband in a pretty sweet vintage paperback that I found at the Cameron's Forbidden Book Chamber. I've been trying to find The Devil Rides Out, but nobody seems to have that one, although I found the sequels in various places. Hammer made a movie out of The Devil Rides Out with Christopher Lee in the 60s, and that was quite a trip. Wheatley, as you can see, was pretty prolific. There's a spinner in the gold room for paperbacks with funky dated covers. I dug through the whole thing this time just because sometimes there's stuff that I'm actually looking for that's just hiding in there. This time I found a vintage 1920s Nick Carter from Vital Books. Like a lot of the books on that spinner, this one was pretty beat up. I don't know what the hell it is, but apparently some shoppers think that you could just jam a book every which way into that spinner and it'll be just fine. But you can see this one's kind of flaky. Otherwise it's intact, so I can actually read it, albeit carefully. If you've ever seen The 7-Year Itch, there's that bit about the paperback industry, the early paperback industry, reselling literary classics in sexed-up forms. I found some examples of that. Casanova's Amorous Adventures and The Best of Balzac. The historical Giacomo Casanova is now sold with taglines about sexy, hot young girls on the loose. Thanks a lot, Madison Avenue. And you know that Balzac is steamy as shit, because here's Brigitte Bardot on the back, striking a pose and plugging a movie called Please, Mr. Balzac, which is one of many alternate titles, actually, for a French 1956 movie called Plucking the Daisy, written by Roger Vadim. And as nearly as I could tell, it has nothing to do with Balzac's writings. If anybody was dead and European, they'd be fair game for this kind of treatment. Like, maybe they did it for Victor Hugo, you know? I don't know. Maybe it's not the worst thing if it got people actually reading the books as opposed to just using the books as pinups. Who knows? One of the pulpy people I'm always looking for is Seabury Quinn, Weird Tales contributor. They totally had the first entry in the Jules de Grandin series, being The Adventures of Jules de Grandin. I actually had a sequel title of this on my list, and I didn't know it was a sequel until I found this one, so better to start with the first. So, surprise series! You can see that it calls itself the Occult Hercule Poirot. I think I actually did read an entry in this series in the 30s Weird Tale issue I read last year. It seems like pretty solid stuff. I was pretty giddy over these from Cameron's Paperback Room. They're Gold-Starred Books Dime Novel Collector's Editions. Each one has 2 Western dime novels, the headliner being either Buffalo Bill or the fictional Young Wild West. I had 2 of these at home already, and I thought for sure that they were the only ones, the only 2 that existed until these jumped out at me. The authors for many of these are anonymous. They're either simply not listed, or in the case of the title character here, they're credited to an old scout. This is actually a fairly common 19th century pulp fiction practice, on both sides of the Atlantic. They would either be an anonymous author, or they'd try to convince the readers that it was a popular author, not using his name. They'd drop hints. At Powell's, I picked up 2 different collections from Weird Tales. Of the 2, I'm more excited about this Worlds of the Weird, partly for portability and for the fact that it has freaking Virgil Finlay illustrations, not just on the cover. The other one's a Barnes & Noble edition, so, you know, cool stories, but the presentation's not as interesting. Also from Cameron's, I found Ralph Min Farley's The Radio Planet from the Radio Man series, which I have been collecting. It's another competitor for Burroughs' Sword and Planet series in the 1930s. Also, there's Otis Adelbert Klein's Outlaws of Mars, which is a sequel to Swordsman of Mars, which I really enjoyed. It's very Burroughs, and Ace isn't shy about telling you so. In addition to these is Donald Keogh's Flying Saucers Are Real, which should be fun. From the same haul also comes Jules Verne's Master of the World. It's a 1961 movie tie-in with good old Vincent Price on the cover. That movie also had Charles Bronson. You can kind of see him really tiny there. And from Powell's comes a dated Jack London's 13 Tales of Terror, which is marketed to people who thought that White Fang was his only damn book. It's referencing blockbuster films of the time for comparison, including the embarrassing and very boring The Deep from Peter Benchley. This is because this was printed in 1978. Apparently a publisher thinks that it doesn't matter what your book looks like in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, just so long as they could sell it right now. And I guess they made their money, but they're idiots. You know, I can't resist any older Dover printing. Plus, I've been waiting to read Hoffman, because he was an inspiration for Poe. So here's The Best Tales of Hoffman. I half suspected this was just a repackaging of Tales of Hoffman, which I already owned. But when I got home, I compared them, and actually they only have 2 stories in common between them. So, pretty sweet deal, and it should make for a badass read. Introduction by you-know-who. So like I said, there's too much good stuff to really cover it all. There's Ace Doubles and other vintage goodies, and Frank Belknap Long, Adventure Series, J. Sheridan Le Fanu, William Morris, and all that jazz. I also found some pretty sweet art books on pulp illustrators or fantasy, and this 70s Rottensteiner fantasy thing, which looks like it's a freaking work of art in itself, really. It's bitchin'. I never really find everything that I'm looking for, and frankly, it'd probably be less fun. It'd be kind of boring if I just cleared my list every time I went down there. I mean, you gotta have something to look forward to. But between the 4 stops that I made at Powell's and the 1 stop I made at Cameron's, I found a ton of stuff. It was a very fruitful visit, and I always love getting down to Portland. Next time, I'm gonna stay in a different hotel. And look, Voodoo Donuts!
Yeah, of course, if my incessant droning is of any use to you, please let me know in comments and whatever other form. I'm probably going to make more book-related videos in the near future. You can see I just can't stop buying them. They are. And, you know, hopefully some cartoons on deck at some point. I know I keep saying that. And maybe some stuff about the artwork, tutorials, whatever else, works in progress. Anything you want to see, make me aware.